Clara Whitfield thought she was just another cook hired to feed cowboys on a remote Arizona ranch. But when raiders attacked and the quiet foreman she'd grown to trust revealed he was actually the wealthy owner who'd been hiding his identity, everything she believed about her place in the world shattered. Now, with bullets flying and her heart on the line, she faced a choice that would determine not just her survival, but whether a woman with nothing to lose could become the one thing a powerful man never knew he needed. But would she risk everything for a love built on lies? The stagecoach wheels screamed against the rocky ground as they rolled to a stop. Clara Whitfield's heart pounded like a war drum as she stepped down into the blazing Arizona heat of 1867. Dust clouds swirled around her worn boots while she clutched her old leather bag tight against her chest. "This here's the Broken Arrow Ranch, miss," the driver called out, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "Biggest cattle operation in 3 counties, they say." Clara's eyes grew wide as she took in the sight before her. Wooden buildings stretched out like a small town, with cowboys moving between them like busy ants. The smell of horses, hay, and something cooking filled her nose. In the distance, mountains rose up like sleeping giants against the bright blue sky. A group of ranch hands stopped their work to stare at her. Some tipped their hats politely, while others just watched with curious eyes. Clara had gotten used to people looking at her that way. A woman traveling alone always drew attention, especially one past 30 with more grit than beauty. "You must be Miss Whitfield." A deep voice made her turn around fast. The man standing before her was tall and lean, with dark hair that caught the sunlight. His clothes were dusty from work, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. Unlike the other cowboys, he didn't look away when she met his gaze. "I'm James McKenna," he said, extending a work-worn hand. "I run things around here." Clara shook his hand, feeling the calluses that told stories of hard work. "Mr. McKenna, thank you for giving me this chance. Let's see how you handle 30 hungry cowboys before we talk about chances," he said, but there was a hint of a smile in his voice. As they walked toward the cookhouse, Clara noticed how the other men watched James. They stepped aside when he passed, but not out of fear. It was respect, the kind that had to be earned through sweat and blood. The cookhouse was bigger than any kitchen Clara had ever worked in. A massive iron stove dominated one wall, its surface already hot from the morning fire. Wooden tables bore the scars of countless meals prepared in haste. Shelves lined the walls, filled with sacks of flour, beans, and salt pork. "The men eat at 5 sharp," James explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "They work from dawn to dusk, and they expect their food to match their effort." Clara ran her fingers along the smooth wooden counter, already imagining the meals she would create here. "I understand, Mr. McKenna. I've fed hungry men before. Not like these men," he said quietly. "They're good workers, but they're also—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're men who've made mistakes. This ranch gives them a second chance, but only if they follow the rules." Something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. His hands were rough from work, but his speech was educated. Most foremen she'd known could barely read, but James McKenna spoke like a man who'd seen more of the world than just cattle ranches. "There's one rule that matters more than all the rest," James continued, his green eyes holding hers. "What happens on this ranch stays on this ranch. We value privacy here, Miss Whitfield. Complete privacy." A shiver ran down Clara's spine despite the desert heat. "Of course, Mr. McKenna. I understand." Through the window, she could see a rider approaching at full speed, his horse lathered with sweat. James tensed immediately, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip before he caught himself. "Trouble?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's always trouble somewhere," James replied, but his eyes never left the approaching rider. "The question is whether it's the kind of trouble that finds you, or the kind you go looking for." The rider pulled up hard in front of the main house, dust billowing around him like a small tornado. He jumped down from his horse and ran toward the building, his spurs jingling with each step. James straightened his shoulders. "I need to handle this. Cookie will show you where you'll be sleeping and help you get settled. Supper's at 5, and the men will be expecting a full meal. He started to leave, then turned back. Miss Whitfield? Welcome to the Broken Arrow. I hope you'll find what you're looking for here. As he walked away, Clara watched him go, questions blooming in her mind like desert flowers after rain. There was something about James McKenna that didn't quite fit, like a piece of a puzzle that belonged to a different picture entirely. The old cowboy called Cookie appeared at her elbow, his weathered face creased with what might have been a smile. Don't mind the boss, miss. He's got a lot on his shoulders, running a place this size. How long have you worked here, Cookie? Clara asked, still watching James through the window. Going on 3 years now, Cookie replied. Best job I ever had, and I've had plenty. Mr. McKenna treats his people fair, long as they earn their keep. Clara nodded, but her mind was already working. Something about this place felt different from the other ranches where she'd worked. The men moved with purpose, but there was an undercurrent of tension, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Clara began to understand that she'd stepped into more than just a new job. She'd entered a world where secrets hung in the air like morning mist, and where the quiet foreman with the educated voice might be hiding more than just his past. The rooster's crow cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Clara's eyes snapped open in her narrow bunk, instantly alert. She'd learned long ago that the first one to the kitchen controlled the day, and she wasn't about to let 30 hungry cowboys down on her first morning. She struck a match and lit the oil lamp, its warm glow pushing back the shadows. The cookhouse felt different in the quiet hours before sunrise, full of possibilities and the promise of sizzling bacon. Within minutes, she had the fire roaring in the massive stove and coffee brewing in the biggest pot she'd ever seen. The familiar routine of cooking calmed her nerves as she mixed biscuit dough and sliced thick strips of bacon. You're up early. James's voice came from the doorway, startling her. Clara turned to find him silhouetted against the gray dawn light, his hat in his hands. Good cooks always are, Mr. McKenna. Coffee's ready if you want some. He stepped into the warm kitchen, and Clara noticed he moved quietly for such a tall man. His boots barely made a sound on the wooden floor. I wanted to apologize for yesterday, he said, accepting the steaming cup she offered. That business with the rider. Sometimes ranch problems can't wait. No need to apologize, Clara replied, returning to her biscuits. I understand that ranch work doesn't follow a schedule. James sipped his coffee, watching her work with eyes that seemed to catalog every movement. You handle that stove like you were born to it. My mother taught me that a woman's worth could be measured by her ability to feed people well, Clara said, rolling out the dough with practiced strokes. Food is love made visible, she used to say. Smart woman. James's voice carried a note of sadness that made Clara glance up from her work. She was. Lost her when I was 16, but her lessons stuck. They worked in comfortable silence after that, Clara preparing breakfast while James tended to small tasks around the kitchen. She noticed how he moved with easy familiarity through the space, as if he'd spent considerable time there before. You know your way around a kitchen, Mr. McKenna, she observed. A flush crept up his neck. A man learns to take care of himself when he has to. The sound of boots on the porch announced the arrival of the first cowboys, drawn by the smell of coffee and bacon. They filed in quietly, still half asleep but polite enough to remove their hats in her presence. Morning, Miss Clara, they mumbled, taking their places at the long wooden tables. Clara served them with efficiency born of years of practice, but she found herself studying their faces. These weren't ordinary ranch hands. Some bore scars that spoke of violence. Others had the careful mannerisms of men who'd learned to watch their backs. Yet they treated her with respect that bordered on reverence. Best breakfast I've had in years, declared a grizzled cowboy with silver hair and kind eyes. Name's Dutch, miss. Been riding for 30 years, and I can tell good cooking when I taste it. Others nodded their agreement, but Clara noticed they all glanced at James before speaking, as if seeking permission. It was subtle, but she'd learned to read the currents that flowed between people. After breakfast, as the men headed out to their daily tasks, Clara began cleaning up. James lingered, helping her clear tables with movements that seemed almost automatic. "You don't have to help," Clara said. "I'm sure you have important foreman duties." "Nothing that can't wait," he replied. But she caught him glancing toward the main house where smoke was rising from the chimney. Through the window, Clara watched the cowboys mount their horses and ride out in different directions. Some headed toward distant pastures, others toward the corrals where wild horses stamped and snorted. The organization was impressive, like watching a well-oiled machine spring to life. "It's a big operation," she commented. James nodded. "Biggest in the territory. Takes a lot of coordination to keep everything running smooth." "And you coordinate it all?" He paused in his work, his hands stilling on the plates he was stacking. "I do my part." Something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. His clothes were well made but worn. His hands showed the calluses of hard work. But there was something about his bearing that suggested he was comfortable with authority in a way that went beyond being a foreman. "How long have you been here, Mr. McKenna?" she asked. 3 years, he said quickly. "Started as a regular hand, worked my way up." Clara nodded, but doubts crept into her mind like shadows at sunset. The other men's deference to him seemed too ingrained for someone who'd only been in charge for a short time. And the way he'd helped in the kitchen spoke of someone who'd spent considerable time managing domestic affairs. A commotion outside drew their attention. 2 riders were approaching fast, their horses breathing hard. James tensed immediately, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "Stay inside," he told Clara, his voice sharp with command. But Clara had never been one to follow orders blindly. She positioned herself near the window where she could see but remain hidden. The riders pulled up in front of the main house, and one of them dismounted quickly. "McKenna," the man called out. "We need to talk." James stepped out of the cookhouse, his posture straight and alert. "What's the trouble, Martinez?" "Cattle missing from the north pasture," the rider replied. 20 head, maybe more. Tracks head toward the canyon. Clara watched James's face harden. "How fresh are the tracks?" "Few hours old, maybe less." James nodded grimly. "Get the men together. We'll need to move fast if we're going to catch them." As the riders spurred their horses toward the bunkhouse, Clara found herself wondering what kind of foreman commanded such immediate obedience. And why did the missing cattle seem to worry James McKenna more than simple theft should worry any ranch employee? The questions multiplied in her mind like ripples in a pond, each one leading to another. She'd come to the Broken Arrow Ranch looking for honest work and a place to belong, but she was beginning to suspect she'd stumbled into something far more complicated than feeding cowboys and keeping house. Outside, men were saddling horses with the swift efficiency of a military unit, and James McKenna stood in the center of it all, directing operations with the natural authority of someone born to command. Clara pressed her hand against the window glass, watching the man who'd hired her transform before her eyes into someone entirely different from the quiet foreman she thought she knew. Blood dripped from Pete Dawson's knuckles as he cornered Clara behind the storage shed. The sunset painted the sky red, matching the anger in his eyes as he blocked her path back to the cookhouse. "You think you're better than the rest of US, don't you?" Pete snarled, stepping closer. His breath reeked of whiskey and something darker. "Coming here with your fancy manners, acting like you own the place." Clara pressed her back against the rough wooden wall, her heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. She'd seen Pete watching her all week, his stares growing bolder each day. Now, with most of the men still out searching for the missing cattle, he'd finally made his move. "I don't want any trouble, Pete," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. "Let me pass, and we'll forget this happened." Pete laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Forget? Lady, I ain't even started yet. You see, I've been thinking about what makes you so special. What makes McKenna treat you like some kind of princess." Clara's hand slowly moved toward the kitchen knife tucked into her apron. Her father had taught her that desperate times called for desperate measures, and Pete's eyes held the look of a man who'd crossed a line he couldn't step back over. "McKenna's been good to all of us," Clara said, hoping to distract him. "He gave you work when others wouldn't." "McKenna," Pete spat. That's another thing that bothers me. Man shows up 3 years ago, acts like he knows everything about running a ranch. Where'd he come from? What's he hiding? Clara's blood turned to ice water. What do you mean? You ain't noticed? The way he talks, the way he handles money like it grows on trees. That ain't no ordinary foreman, lady. And I'm gonna find out what his real story is. Before Clara could respond, the thunder of approaching horses filled the air. James appeared around the corner of the shed, his face dark as a storm cloud when he saw Pete standing too close to Clara. Problem here? James asked, his voice deadly quiet. Pete straightened up, trying to look casual, but Clara could see the sweat beading on his forehead. Just having a friendly chat with the cook, boss. Didn't look friendly from where I stood. James stepped between Pete and Clara, his hand resting on his gun. Maybe you should head to the bunkhouse and sleep off whatever you've been drinking. Sure thing, boss. Pete's smile was all teeth and no warmth. But you might want to ask yourself who you can really trust around here. Sometimes the biggest danger comes from the inside. As Pete walked away, Clara felt James's tension like heat from a fire. His jaw was clenched tight, and his eyes followed Pete's retreating figure with the intensity of a hunter tracking prey. Are you hurt? James asked, turning to face her. I'm fine, Clara said, though her hands were still shaking. He was just talking, but what? Clara hesitated. Pete's words about James echoed in her mind, adding weight to her own growing suspicions. He seems to think you're not who you say you are. James went very still. What did he tell you? Nothing specific. Just questions about where you came from, how you know so much about running a ranch. Clara studied his face, looking for answers in the lines around his eyes. Are you going to tell me he's wrong? For a long moment, James said nothing. The setting sun cast shadows across his features, making him look older, more tired. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of secrets too heavy to bear alone. There are things about my past that I can't discuss, he said carefully. Not because I don't trust you, but because some knowledge can be dangerous. Dangerous how? James glanced around, making sure they were alone. Clara, there are men who would do terrible things to get what they think I have. The less you know, the safer you are. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. What kind of men? The kind that burned down my last ranch and killed 2 good men who worked for me. James's voice was barely above a whisper. The kind that don't care who gets hurt as long as they get what they want. The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd known there were secrets at the Broken Arrow, but she'd imagined nothing like this. Why didn't you tell me? Because I hoped they'd never find me here. I hoped I could build something clean, something honest, without the past catching up. James looked out at the darkening horizon. But hope and reality don't always match up. Clara reached out and touched his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. What are you going to do? Protect what matters, James said simply. Whatever it takes. As they walked back toward the cookhouse, Clara's mind raced with new questions. Who was James McKenna really? What had he done to make such dangerous enemies? And most importantly, was she safe here? Or had she stumbled into the middle of a war she didn't understand? The main house glowed with lamplight in the gathering darkness, and Clara noticed for the first time how the windows were positioned to give clear views in all directions. What she'd taken for a simple ranch house now looked more like a fortress, built by someone who knew how to watch for danger. Behind them, Pete Dawson stood in the shadows of the bunkhouse, his eyes glittering with malice and calculation. Clara couldn't shake the feeling that their conversation had lit a fuse on something explosive, and she had no idea how long they had before it went off. The supply wagon that should have arrived Tuesday morning was now 5 days late. Clara stood in the empty pantry, counting their remaining supplies with growing worry. 3 sacks of flour, 2 of beans, and barely enough salt pork to last another day. This ain't right, Cookie muttered, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Old Tom's been running supplies to this ranch for 10 years. Never missed a delivery, not even during the Apache troubles. Clara nodded, but her attention was drawn to the heated discussion taking place outside. Through the kitchen window, She could see James talking with Dutch and two other senior hands. Their voices were low, but their body language spoke of serious trouble. Maybe the wagon broke down, Clara suggested, though she didn't believe it herself. Maybe, Cookie agreed, but his weathered face showed doubt. Or maybe someone doesn't want supplies getting through. The kitchen door swung open, and James entered with Dutch close behind. Both men looked grim, like soldiers bringing news from a losing battle. "How long can you stretch what we have?" James asked without preamble. Clara did quick calculations in her head. 3 days, maybe 4 if the men don't mind thin soup and smaller portions. "They'll mind," Dutch said grimly. "Hungry cowboys are dangerous cowboys, especially when they start wondering why there ain't enough food." James ran his hand through his dark hair, a gesture Clara had noticed he made when deeply troubled. "I'll ride to town myself. Buy supplies from the general store if I have to." "That's a 2-day ride," Dutch pointed out. "And if someone's watching the roads, then I'll have to risk it." James's voice carried the finality of a man who'd made up his mind. "We can't let the men go hungry." Clara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "It's too dangerous. Send someone else." James looked at her with surprise, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "I can't ask any of my men to take risks I won't take myself." "But you're—" Clara caught herself before saying "too important," realizing she still wasn't supposed to know his true role. "You're needed here. What if something happens while you're gone? Dutch can handle things for a few days." "Can he handle Pete Dawson?" Clara asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire. James and Dutch exchanged looks that spoke of shared concerns and unspoken worries. "What about Pete?" Dutch asked. Clara glanced at James, wondering how much she should reveal. "He's been asking questions. About Mr. McKenna's background, about how he knows so much about running a ranch." Dutch's face darkened. "That fool's always been trouble. Maybe it's time we cut him loose." "We can't fire a man just for asking questions," James said, but Clara heard the doubt in his voice. "We can if those questions put everyone at risk," Dutch replied. "Boss, that man's got mean in him. I seen it in his eyes when he looks at Miss Clara here." James went very still. "What do you mean?" "Yesterday evening, after most of the boys rode out, I seen him following her around, staying just far enough back to think he was being sneaky, but close enough to—" Dutch trailed off, glancing at Clara. "Close enough to what?" James's voice had turned dangerous. "Close enough to be planning something that ain't none of his business." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she remembered Pete's words behind the storage shed. The way he'd looked at her, the things he'd implied about James, the barely contained violence in his manner. "There's more," she said quietly. "He thinks you're hiding something important. He said he's going to find out what your real story is." James and Dutch stared at each other for a long moment. Clara could practically see the silent communication passing between them, the weight of shared secrets and mutual trust. "How much does he know?" Dutch asked. "Nothing for certain," James replied. "But if he starts digging, asking the wrong people the wrong questions, could lead them right to us," Dutch finished. Clara's heart began to race. "Lead who to you? What are you talking about?" James looked at her with eyes full of regret and something that might have been fear. "Clara, I told you some knowledge could be dangerous. This is what I meant." "But I'm already involved, aren't I?" Clara pressed. "Whatever's coming, it's going to affect all of us. Don't I have a right to know what I'm facing?" Before James could answer, the sound of approaching horses made all 3 of them freeze. Dutch moved to the window, his hand instinctively dropping to his gun. 3 riders, he reported. "Don't recognize them." James joined him at the window, and Clara saw his face go pale. "Get Clara to the root cellar," he ordered. "Now." "I'm not hiding," Clara said firmly. "This is my home too." "Clara, please." James turned to face her, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, genuine fear. Not for himself, but for her. "These men, if they're who I think they are, they won't hesitate to hurt innocent people to get what they want. Dutch was already moving toward the trapdoor that led to the storm cellar. "Miss Clara, the boss is right. These ain't the kind of men you want to meet." The riders were closer now, and Clara could hear the jingle of spurs, the creak of leather, the low murmur of voices planning something that made grown men afraid. "Promise me," James said, gripping her shoulders gently. "Promise me you'll stay hidden until this is over." Clara looked into his eyes and saw everything he couldn't say, the depth of his feeling for her, the weight of his fear, the terrible knowledge that some battles couldn't be won without sacrifice. "I promise," she whispered, though every instinct in her body screamed against hiding, while the man she cared about faced danger alone. As Dutch helped her down into the dark cellar, Clara heard the riders pull up outside. Their voices carried through the walls, cold and professional, speaking of business that had nothing to do with cattle or honest ranch work. Above her head, James McKenna prepared to face whatever demons had finally caught up with his carefully constructed new life, and Clara realized that everything she thought she knew about the Broken Arrow Ranch was about to change forever. Gunfire erupted above Clara's head like thunder in a summer storm. She pressed herself against the cold stone wall of the root cellar, her heart beating so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Through the wooden floor above, she could hear boots running, men shouting, and the sharp crack of rifles echoing across the ranch yard. "Stay down, miss," Cookie whispered from beside her in the darkness. His ancient hands shook as he clutched his old rifle. "This ain't the kind of fight for decent folks to see." Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out as something heavy crashed to the floor above them. Dust rained down through the cracks between the boards, coating her hair and making her want to sneeze. The sounds of battle raged on, each gunshot making her jump like a startled rabbit. "James," she whispered, his name barely a breath on her lips. Through a gap in the floorboards, she could see flashes of movement, men diving for cover, muzzle flares lighting up the growing darkness, shadows dancing like demons in the lamplight. The acrid smell of gunpowder drifted down to them, mixing with the musty scent of stored potatoes and onions. "Who are they?" Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Cookie's weathered face looked older in the dim light filtering through the cellar entrance. "Men with long memories and short tempers, I reckon. The kind that don't forgive and don't forget." A new voice cut through the chaos above, cold, commanding, and filled with deadly purpose. "We know you're in there, McKenna. Come out and face what's coming like a man." Clara's blood turned to ice water. The voice belonged to someone who enjoyed other people's pain, someone who traveled a long way to settle old scores. She pressed her eye to the crack in the floorboards, trying to see what was happening. The kitchen was a wreck. Tables lay overturned, pots and pans scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers. Through the shattered window, she could see men positioned behind water troughs and fence posts, their rifles trained on the main house where James had taken shelter. "This is your last chance," the cold voice called again. "Surrender now, and we'll make it quick." James's reply came from somewhere near the house, calm, steady, but carrying an edge that made Clara shiver. "You want me, Cord Sullivan? Come and take me." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about Cord Sullivan in other towns, other places where she'd worked. He was a man who took what he wanted and killed anyone who stood in his way. But why was he here? What did he want with James? "Stubborn as always," Sullivan called back. "Fine by me. Boys, burn them out." Clara watched in horror as one of Sullivan's men lit a torch and hurled it toward the bunkhouse. The dry wood caught fire immediately, flames racing up the walls like hungry animals. In the orange glow, she could see Sullivan himself, a tall man with silver hair and eyes like winter ice. "The bunkhouse," Cookie gasped. "All the boys' belongings." But Clara barely heard him. Her attention was fixed on a figure moving through the shadows near the corral, Pete Dawson, creeping toward the main house with a rifle in his hands and betrayal written across his face. "Cookie," she whispered urgently. "Pete's working with them." The old cowboy squinted through the crack. "That no-good snake. I knew something was wrong with that boy from the day he showed up." Clara's mind raced. If Pete had been feeding information to Sullivan's gang, he would know about the root cellar. He would know where she was hiding. And from the way he'd looked at her behind the storage shed, she didn't think he planned to let her live to tell anyone about his treachery. "We have to warn James," she said, moving toward the cellar entrance. Cookie grabbed her arm. "Miss Clara, you can't. It's suicide out there." "It's suicide if we stay here too," Clara replied grimly. "Pete knows about this hiding spot. He'll be coming for us next." As if summoned by her words, footsteps approached the cookhouse. Heavy boots, moving with purpose rather than haste. Clara felt her throat close with fear as she recognized the distinctive jingle of Pete's spurs. Well, Pete's voice drifted down to them, thick with satisfaction. "Look what we have here. The famous James McKenna, hiding in his own kitchen like a scared rabbit." Clara realized with growing horror that Pete thought James was down in the cellar with them. He didn't know that James was still in the main house, still fighting for his life against impossible odds. "Come on out, boss," Pete continued, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "Mr. Sullivan just wants to have a little chat about some property that rightfully belongs to him." Property? Clara's mind struggled to understand what that could mean. What property could Sullivan possibly want from a ranch foreman? Unless the pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place with sickening clarity. James wasn't just the foreman of the Broken Arrow Ranch. He owned it, and somehow Cord Sullivan had a claim to it or thought he did. "You hear me down there?" Pete called again. Last chance to come out peaceful. Clara heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Pete was done waiting. In seconds, he would start shooting through the floor, and there was nowhere for them to run. She looked at Cookie's frightened face, thought about James fighting alone against overwhelming odds, and made a decision that would either save them all or get them killed. "Pete!" she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. "It's Clara. James isn't down here." The silence that followed stretched like a taut rope. Then Pete's laughter filled the air, cold, cruel, and absolutely terrifying. "Even better," he said. "Sullivan's gonna be real pleased when I bring him McKenna's lady friend." Real pleased indeed. The storm that had been building all day finally broke just as Pete kicked in the cellar door. Lightning split the sky like God's own rifle shot, and rain began falling in sheets that turned the ranch yard into a muddy battlefield. Clara scrambled up the ladder with Cookie right behind her, her hands slipping on the wet rungs. Pete stood silhouetted in the doorway, water streaming from his hat brim. His gun pointed directly at her heart. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Pete sneered. The cook and the old man, hiding like mice in a hole. Clara's hand found the heavy iron skillet she'd been using that morning. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. "What do you want, Pete?" "What I want is to settle some old debts," Pete replied, stepping closer. "See, Miss Clara, your boyfriend ain't who he says he is. James McKenna owns this whole spread, lock, stock, and barrel. Problem is, he stole it from better men." The rain hammered against the roof like 1,000 tiny hammers. Through the broken window, Clara could see the gunfight still raging in the yard, muzzle flashes lighting up the storm like deadly fireflies. "That's a lie," Clara said, though doubt crept into her voice like cold water. Pete's smile was all teeth and malice. "Is it? Ask yourself this, how does a working cowboy afford to run an operation this size? Where'd he get the money to buy all them cattle, all them horses?" Cookie stepped protectively in front of Clara, his ancient rifle shaking in his hands. "Don't matter where the money came from. Mr. McKenna's been good to all of us." "Good?" Pete laughed harshly. "He's been living a lie. That money belonged to Cord Sullivan's brother. McKenna stole it during a card game in Denver, then killed the man when he tried to get it back." Clara felt the world tilt around her like a ship in rough seas. "No, James wouldn't." "Wouldn't what? Kill a man? Steal money? Lady, you don't know him at all." Pete's eyes glittered with cruel satisfaction. "Sullivan's been hunting him for 3 years. Now it's time to pay the bill." Another crash of thunder shook the building, and in the brief silence that followed, Clara heard something that chilled her blood, James's voice, calling her name through the storm. "Clara, where are you?" Pete's head snapped toward the sound. Well, well, sounds like lover boy's coming to save you. Too bad he's walking into a trap. Before Clara could think, before fear could stop her, she swung the iron skillet with all her strength, connected with Pete's skull with a sound like a melon hitting the ground. He dropped like a sack of grain, his gun skittering across the wet floor. Miss Clara, Cookie gasped. You killed him. Clara knelt beside Pete's still form, checking for breath. No, just knocked him cold. But he won't stay that way long. She grabbed Pete's gun, checking to make sure it was loaded. The weight of it felt strange in her hands, but her father had taught her to shoot when she was young. Some skills, once learned, were never forgotten. We have to find James, she said, moving toward the door. Cookie caught her arm. Miss, it's suicide out there. Sullivan's got a dozen men. Then James needs all the help he can get. Clara stepped out into the storm, immediately soaked to the skin by the driving rain. The ranch yard was chaos. Overturned wagons, scattered supplies, and men taking cover wherever they could find it. The bunkhouse was fully ablaze now, flames hissing and smoking in the downpour. Through the rain and smoke, she saw James pinned down behind a water trough near the main house. 2 of Sullivan's men were advancing on his position, using the storm as cover. He was trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to fight back against such odds. Clara raised Pete's gun, aimed carefully despite her shaking hands, and fired. One of the advancing men spun and fell, crying out in pain and surprise. The second man whirled toward her, his rifle swinging in her direction. Time seemed to slow as Clara saw the muzzle flash, heard the bullet whine past her ear like an angry wasp. She dove sideways, rolling behind an overturned feed trough just as another shot splintered the wood inches from her head. Clara! James's voice carried desperation and rage in equal measure. Get back inside. But Clara was already moving, using the storm and the confusion to work her way closer to James's position. She'd spent her whole life being careful, being safe, following other people's rules. Tonight, the only rule that mattered was protecting the man she loved. A figure loomed out of the rain in front of her, one of Sullivan's men, his face twisted with murderous intent. Clara didn't hesitate. She pulled the trigger and the man went down hard. Behind you! James shouted. Clara spun to see another gunman emerging from the smoke of the burning bunkhouse. But before she could react, a rifle cracked from somewhere to her left. The gunman staggered and fell, and Clara saw Dutch rising from behind a pile of lumber, smoke curling from his weapon. This way, miss, Dutch called. We can reach the boss if we move now. Clara ran through the mud and rain, bullets whining around her like deadly insects. Her heart pounded as she dove into cover beside James, who immediately pulled her against him with fierce protectiveness. What are you doing out here? He demanded, his green eyes wild with fear for her safety. Saving your life? Clara replied, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. Pete was working with them. He told me things. About you, about Sullivan's brother. James's face went white. Clara, whatever he told you. We'll talk about it later, she said firmly. Right now, we need to figure out how to get out of this alive. A new voice cut through the storm, cold, commanding, and filled with deadly certainty. Give it up, McKenna. You're outnumbered and outgunned. Send out the woman, and maybe I'll let some of your men live. James's grip on his rifle tightened. Over my dead body. Sullivan's laughter carried on the wind like the howl of a coyote. That can be arranged. As if to emphasize his point, gunfire erupted from all sides, turning their small shelter into a death trap with no escape and no hope of rescue. The dynamite stick with its hissing fuse landed 3 feet from where Clara crouched behind the water trough. She had maybe 5 seconds before the explosion would turn her and James into scattered pieces across the muddy ranch yard. Without thinking, Clara lunged forward and grabbed the stick of dynamite, her fingers closing around the wet cylinder just as James shouted her name in pure terror. The fuse burned closer to her hand, sparks flying in the driving rain. She hurled it toward the empty horse corral with every ounce of strength in her body. The dynamite spun through the air like a deadly shooting star, trailing smoke and fire through the storm. Clara threw herself flat just as the world exploded in light and thunder. The blast lifted her off the ground, slamming her into the side of the water trough hard enough to drive the breath from her lungs. Pieces of fence post and corral rail rained down around them like deadly hail. Her ears rang so loudly she couldn't hear James calling her name. "Clara! Clara! Can you hear me?" James's voice seemed to come from very far away, though his hands were gentle on her face. She blinked, trying to clear her vision. I'm okay," she managed, though her ribs felt like someone had kicked them with iron boots. Dutch appeared beside them, his weathered face grim with determination. "Boss, we got maybe 30 seconds before they regroup. We need to move now." Clara struggled to sit up, accepting James's help. Through the smoke and rain, she could see Sullivan's men scattered by the explosion, some picking themselves up from the mud, others calling out to their fallen companions. "The main house," James said, helping Clara to her feet. "We can make a stand there." They ran through the chaos, splashing through puddles and dodging debris from the explosion. Clara's legs felt weak as water, but James's strong arm around her waist kept her moving. Behind them, she could hear Sullivan shouting orders to his remaining men. The main house loomed before them like a fortress. Its thick log walls and small windows had been built to withstand Indian attacks in the early days. Now they would have to serve the same purpose against a different kind of enemy. James kicked open the front door and pulled Clara inside, Dutch close behind them. The interior was dark except for the glow from the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Barricade the windows," James ordered, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. "Use whatever you can find." As they worked, pushing furniture against the windows and checking their ammunition, Clara noticed things about the house she'd never seen before. Maps covered one wall, showing cattle routes and water sources across 3 territories. A safe stood open in the corner, revealing stacks of money and important-looking papers. "James," she said quietly, "we need to talk." He paused in loading his rifle, meeting her eyes across the room. "I know what Pete told you. About Sullivan's brother, about the money. Is it true?" James was quiet for a long moment, the only sounds the patter of rain against the windows and Dutch's movements as he prepared their defenses. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years' worth of secrets. "Robert Sullivan was a cheat and a killer," James said slowly. "He tried to murder me during a card game in Denver because I caught him dealing from the bottom of the deck. I shot him in self-defense, and yes, I took his money. But not because I was a thief." Clara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. "Then why?" "Because he'd been using that money to buy guns for raiders who were terrorizing homesteaders. Innocent families were dying because of Robert Sullivan's greed." James's green eyes met hers steadily. "I used his money to buy this ranch, to give decent men honest work, to build something good from something evil." Dutch nodded grimly. "It's true, miss. I was there in Denver. Saw the whole thing. Mr. McKenna saved a lot of lives by stopping Robert Sullivan." Clara stared at James, trying to process everything she'd learned. The man she'd fallen in love with wasn't a simple ranch foreman. He was wealthy, educated, and had killed a man. But he'd also used blood money to create jobs for cowboys who couldn't find work anywhere else. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Because I was afraid," James admitted. "Afraid you'd look at me differently. Afraid you'd see a killer instead of a man trying to make amends for the violence in his past." Before Clara could respond, Sullivan's voice boomed across the yard. "I know you're in there, McKenna. You can't hide forever." James moved to the window, peering through a gap in the barricade. "What do you want, Sullivan? Your brother's dead and buried. Nothing's going to change that." "I want what's mine," Sullivan roared back. "That money you stole bought this ranch. Everything here belongs to me by right. Your brother was using that money to arm killers." James shouted. "I put it to better use." Sullivan's laughter was cold as winter wind. "Noble words from a murderer. But it doesn't matter what you did with the money. What matters is that you're going to pay for Robert's death." Clara joined James at the window, her hand finding his. He's not going to listen to reason, is he? Men like Cord Sullivan don't know what reason is, James replied grimly. They only understand violence and revenge. Dutch checked his rifle one more time. Boss, they're setting up for another attack. Look there, by the barn. Clara followed his gaze and saw Sullivan's remaining men taking positions around the house. There were still 8 or 9 of them, all heavily armed and determined to finish what they'd started. How much ammunition do we have? James asked. Enough for maybe 15 minutes of fighting, Dutch replied. After that, he didn't need to finish. They all knew what would happen when the bullets ran out. Clara looked around the room that had become their fortress. Maps of the territory, business ledgers, and legal documents spoke of James's efforts to build something lasting and good. Whatever mistakes he'd made in Denver, he tried to make up for them here at the Broken Arrow. There's something else, James said quietly, his voice barely audible over the storm. Something I should have told you from the beginning. Clara's heart skipped. What? James pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Even in the dim light, Clara could see it was a marriage certificate, signed but not dated. I've been carrying this since the day you arrived, James said, his eyes intense in the firelight. I know it's crazy, and I know we barely know each other, but what? Clara whispered. But I love you, Clara Whitfield, and if we're going to die tonight, I want you to know that you're the best thing that ever happened to me. Before Clara could respond, the sound of breaking glass filled the air. Sullivan's men were throwing rocks through the remaining windows, preparing for their final assault. Here they come, Dutch shouted. Rifle fire exploded from every direction as Sullivan's men charged the house like soldiers storming a castle. Clara pressed herself against the thick log wall, her heart pounding as bullets shattered the remaining glass and splintered the wooden shutters they'd used for protection. Stay low, James commanded, returning fire through a gap in the barricade. His rifle cracked steadily, each shot carefully aimed and devastating in its accuracy. Clara clutched Pete's gun, waiting for her chance to help. Through the chaos, she could see shadowy figures moving closer to the house, using the storm and darkness as cover. One man made it to the front porch before Dutch's rifle sent him tumbling back into the mud. They're trying to get to the back door, Dutch called out, swinging his weapon toward the rear of the house. James cursed under his breath. Clara watched the front. I'll help, Dutch. Left alone at the main window, Clara felt fear rise in her throat like bile. She'd never been in a real fight before tonight, and now she was defending their lives with a borrowed gun and determination that felt as fragile as paper. A face appeared at the window, one of Sullivan's men, his eyes wild with violence and greed. Clara didn't hesitate. She fired, and the man disappeared with a scream that cut through the storm. Nice shot, miss, Dutch called from across the room. You're a natural. Clara wasn't sure whether to feel proud or sick. She'd never killed anyone before tonight, but these men had come to murder James and destroy everything good about the Broken Arrow Ranch. Sometimes, her father had taught her, violence was the only language evil understood. James, she called. Someone's on the roof. Heavy footsteps moved overhead, and pieces of dirt fell from between the ceiling logs. Whoever was up there was trying to find a way inside, maybe through the chimney or a loose board. James appeared beside her, his face grim with determination. Dutch, keep them busy at the back door. Clara and I will handle our uninvited guest. They moved through the house like dancers who'd practiced their steps for years. James took position near the fireplace while Clara covered the main room. The footsteps overhead grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the front door exploded inward as someone kicked it with tremendous force. 2 men rushed inside, guns blazing, but they'd made a fatal mistake. In their hurry to get out of the storm, they'd silhouetted themselves perfectly against the gray light from outside. Clara and James fired at the same instant. Both attackers went down hard, their weapons clattering across the wooden floor. 4 down, 5 to go, James said grimly, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. But Clara had stopped listening. Through the broken doorway, she could see a figure moving through the rain toward the house. Even in the darkness and storm, she recognized the tall frame and silver hair of Cord Sullivan himself. "He's coming," she whispered. James followed her gaze and tensed like a coiled spring. Sullivan, the man who'd started this war, stepped onto the porch, his long coat dripping water, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight from inside the house. He held a rifle casually, as if it weighed no more than a walking stick. "Quite a fight you've put up, McKenna," Sullivan called, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. "But it's time to end this. You killed my brother, and now you're going to pay." "Your brother was a murderer and a thief," James replied, stepping into view. "The world's a better place without him." Sullivan's face twisted with rage. "Robert was family. Blood. You had no right to take him from me. I had every right to defend myself when he tried to put a bullet in my back." For a moment, the two men stared at each other through the doorway, rain and wind swirling between them like the ghosts of old grudges. Clara could feel the weight of their shared history, the pain and anger that had brought them to this moment. "I'll make you a deal," Sullivan said suddenly. "You come out here and face me man to man. If you win, my boys and I ride away. If I win, I take everything of the ranch, the money, and the woman." Clara felt ice form in her veins. "James, no." But James was already moving toward the door, his rifle held ready. "What guarantee do I have that you'll honor the deal?" Sullivan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You have my word as a Sullivan. That used to mean something. It stopped meaning something when your brother started selling guns to killers," James replied. "But I'll take your deal anyway." "James, don't." Clara grabbed his arm, trying to stop him. "It's a trap." "Maybe," James agreed, his green eyes soft as he looked down at her. "But it's the only way to end this without getting you and Dutch killed." He leaned down and kissed her, gentle and fierce at the same time. "If something happens to me, take that marriage certificate and get as far from here as you can. Start over somewhere safe." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Clara said fiercely. "I won't let it." James smiled, the expression transforming his battle-hardened face into something young and hopeful. "I love you, Clara Whitfield. Remember that, no matter what happens next." Before she could stop him, he stepped out into the storm to face the man who'd come to kill him. Clara watched through the doorway as the two men walked toward each other, their footsteps muffled by the rain and mud. Lightning flashed, illuminating the ranch yard like a photograph frozen in time. In that brief moment of clarity, Clara saw something that made her blood run cold. Sullivan's remaining men, positioned around the yard with their rifles trained on James. The deal was a lie. Whatever happened in the fight between James and Sullivan, the other men would make sure James didn't survive to claim victory. Clara raised Pete's gun, checking the remaining bullets. 3 shots left. Not enough to stop all of Sullivan's men, but maybe enough to give James a fighting chance. In the yard, the two men faced each other like gunfighters in the stories she'd heard as a child. But this wasn't a story. This was real, and the man she loved was about to die unless she could find a way to save him. Thunder rolled across the sky like the voice of an angry god, and Clara Whitfield prepared to fight for the future she'd never dared to dream she deserved. The crack of Sullivan's rifle split the night air like breaking bone. Clara watched in horror as James stumbled backward, clutching his left shoulder where blood bloomed dark against his white shirt. He'd been faster on the draw, but Sullivan had cheated, firing before the agreed signal. "You always were too trusting, McKenna," Sullivan snarled, working the lever on his rifle for another shot. Clara didn't think. She burst from the house into the driving rain, her gun blazing. Her first shot caught Sullivan in the leg, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the mud. Her second shot shattered the lantern one of his hidden men was using for light, plunging that section of the yard into darkness. "The deal's off," she screamed over the storm. "Your boss is a lying snake." James rolled behind an overturned wagon just as bullets started flying from every direction. Clara dove for cover behind a water barrel, her heart hammering like a blacksmith's anvil. She had 1 bullet left, and at least 4 men were still shooting at them. "Clara!" James called through the chaos. "Get back inside." Not without you, she shouted back, trying to spot the muzzle flashes in the darkness. Dutch appeared at the broken doorway of the house, his ancient rifle speaking thunder. One of Sullivan's men cried out and fell, but the others kept firing, their bullets chipping wood and stone around Clara's hiding spot. Sullivan pulled himself to his feet, favoring his wounded leg but still dangerous as a cornered wolf. Kill them all, he roared. Burn everything. I want nothing left standing. Clara saw one of his men moving toward the barn with a torch, intent on setting fire to everything James had built. She raised her gun, took careful aim despite her shaking hands, and fired her last bullet. The man dropped the torch and fell, but the flame caught the dry hay scattered around the barn entrance. The horses! Dutch yelled. They're gonna burn alive! Without thinking, Clara ran toward the burning barn. She could hear the animals screaming in terror, kicking at their stall doors as smoke began to fill the building. Her father had always taught her that innocent creatures deserved protection, no matter the cost. James saw her running and cursed loud enough to wake the dead. He broke from cover, ignoring the bullets whining around him, and chased after her into the smoke-filled barn. Inside, the air was thick as soup and twice as deadly. Clara fumbled with the first stall door, her eyes streaming tears from the smoke. A magnificent black stallion reared and struck at the air, wild with fear but too scared to run past the flames blocking the entrance. Easy, boy, Clara whispered, the same tone she used when gentling frightened children. We're here to help. James appeared beside her, his shirt torn and bloody but his hands steady as he worked to free the horses. You're crazy, you know that? He said, but there was admiration in his voice. Crazy enough to love a man who owns a ranch and pretends to be a foreman, Clara replied, opening another stall door. They worked together, freeing horse after horse and driving them toward the rear exit of the barn. The animals trusted James completely, following his voice even through their terror. Clara understood why. There was something in his manner that spoke of absolute reliability, the kind of strength that held steady when everything else fell apart. The last horse, a young mare with a white blaze on her forehead, refused to move. She stood trembling in her stall, too frightened to run despite the growing flames. Go, James told Clara. I'll get her. We go together or not at all, Clara said firmly. James looked at her through the smoke, his green eyes bright with something that might have been love or might have been desperation. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met. Good thing you like stubborn women, Clara replied, reaching for the mare's halter. Together, they coaxed the frightened animal toward safety. The barn creaked and groaned around them as the fire spread, eating at the wooden beams like a hungry monster. Heat pressed against their backs, growing stronger with each step. They burst out of the burning barn just as part of the roof collapsed behind them. The freed horses scattered across the pasture, their hoofbeats like thunder as they ran from the flames. But their escape from the fire brought them face to face with Cord Sullivan, who stood waiting with a pistol in each hand despite his wounded leg. His pale eyes reflected the firelight like chips of ice. Touching, he said, his voice cold as winter wind. But it doesn't change anything. You still killed my brother, and you're still going to pay. Clara stepped protectively in front of James, even though she had no weapons left to fight with. Your brother was a killer. James did the world a favor. Sullivan's smile was sharp as a knife blade. Maybe so, but family is family, and blood demands blood. Behind them, Dutch and the remaining ranch hands were still fighting Sullivan's men, but the battle was moving farther away. Here, in the flickering light of the burning barn, it was just the three of them and the weight of old sins demanding payment. I'll make you the same deal I made your brother, James said quietly, stepping out from behind Clara despite her protests. Fair fight, winner takes all. But this time we do it honest. Sullivan considered this, his head tilted like a curious bird. What makes you think I care about honest? Because you came all this way for revenge, not money, James replied. This is personal for you. Personal demands satisfaction, not just victory. Clara held her breath as Sullivan weighed the offer. Around them, the storm was beginning to fade, but the fire cast dancing shadows that made everything look like a scene from hell itself. Finally, Sullivan nodded. Fair fight it is. But when I kill you, the woman comes with me. Insurance that your men don't try anything stupid. No, James said flatly. Clara stays out of this. Then no deal, Sullivan replied, raising his guns. Clara stepped forward before either man could stop her. I accept his terms. Both men stared at her in shock. James looked like she'd struck him with a hammer, while Sullivan's eyebrows rose in surprise. Clara, no, James said desperately. You don't understand what you're agreeing to. I understand perfectly, Clara replied, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. I also understand that this is the only way to end this without more good people dying. She turned to face Sullivan, meeting his cold gaze with determination that surprised even herself. But I have terms of my own. Clara stood between the two men like a judge preparing to pronounce sentence. The firelight painted her face in shades of gold and crimson, making her look older, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous than either man had given her credit for. My terms are simple, she said, her voice carrying across the ranch yard with surprising authority. This ends tonight one way or another. No more running, no more hiding, no more innocent people getting hurt because of old grudges. Sullivan laughed, but there was uncertainty in the sound. You're in no position to make demands, woman. Aren't I? Clara smiled, and there was something in that smile that made both men take a step back. I'm the one thing you both want to protect. That gives me more power than all your guns combined. James stared at her with a mixture of admiration and terror. Clara, what are you doing? What I should have done from the beginning, she replied. Taking control of my own fate instead of letting other people decide it for me. She turned to Sullivan, her eyes hard as flint. You want James dead because he killed your brother. But what will that really accomplish? Will it bring Robert back? Will it erase the crimes he committed? Or will it just add more blood to an already bloody story? Sullivan's grip tightened on his guns. Justice demands payment. Justice. Clara's voice rose with righteous anger. Your brother was selling weapons to men who murdered families. Where was justice for those innocent children? Where was justice for the homesteaders who died because of his greed? For the first time since the fight began, Sullivan looked uncertain. Robert made mistakes. Robert was evil, Clara said bluntly. And you know it. You've spent 3 years hunting James not because you loved your brother, but because you can't admit that James did the right thing when he stopped Robert from killing more innocent people. The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the burning barn and the distant sound of gunfire as the last of Sullivan's men were driven off by Dutch and the ranch hands. Even if that's true, Sullivan said finally, it doesn't change what happened. James killed my bloodkin. Yes, he did, Clara agreed. And he spent every day since then trying to make up for it by building something good. Look around you, Mr. Sullivan. This ranch employs 30 men who couldn't find honest work anywhere else. It feeds families, protects livestock, brings civilization to the wilderness. That's James's real payment for what happened in Denver. James stepped closer to Clara, his voice rough with emotion. Clara, you don't have to defend me. Yes, I do, she replied firmly. Because someone needs to speak the truth, and you're too noble to do it yourself. She faced Sullivan again, her small frame somehow commanding the attention of both armed men. I'll make you a different deal, Mr. Sullivan. Take me hostage if you want. Hold a gun to my head. But first, tell me honestly, will killing James McKenna bring you peace? Or will it just make you into the same kind of man your brother was? Sullivan's hands began to shake, and Clara could see the war being fought behind his pale eyes. Grief, anger, and years of bitter hatred warred with the growing realization that his quest for revenge had turned him into something he might not recognize. He killed Robert, Sullivan whispered, but the words lacked their earlier conviction. Robert killed himself, Clara said gently. The moment he chose to become a killer, he signed his own death warrant. James was just the instrument of justice, not its cause. James watched in amazement as Clara did something no amount of gunfire had accomplished. She was breaking through Sullivan's armor of rage and making him see the truth he'd been running from for 3 years. "I have another proposal," Clara continued. "James has money, resources, connections. What if, instead of destroying what he's built, you helped him use those resources to make up for what your brother did? What if we work together to help the families that Robert's actions harmed?" Sullivan stared at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. "Work together? With the man who killed my brother. With the man who's trying to heal the wounds your brother inflicted," Clara corrected. "Don't you think Robert would want his death to mean something? Don't you think he'd want his family to be remembered for helping people instead of hurting them?" For a long moment, the only sounds were the storm wind and the distant thunder of horses' hooves as the last of Sullivan's men fled into the night. Clara held her breath, knowing that the next words spoken would determine whether this ended in more death or the beginning of something resembling peace. Sullivan slowly lowered his guns, his shoulders sagging as if a great weight had been lifted from them. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years I've lived for nothing but revenge. You can live for something better now, Clara said softly. We all can. James stepped forward, his hand extended despite the blood still flowing from his shoulder wound. What do you say, Sullivan? Want to try building something instead of tearing it down? Sullivan looked at the offered hand for a long time. When he finally reached out and grasped it, Clara felt something tight in her chest finally relax. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sullivan said honestly, but maybe I can learn to live with what happened. That's all any of us can do, James replied. Learn to live with our choices and try to make better ones going forward. As the three of them stood in the flickering light of the dying fire, Clara realized that she'd done more than save James's life. She'd given two bitter enemies a chance to become something other than what their past had made them. The storm was passing, and in the distance, she could see the first hint of dawn breaking over the Arizona mountains. It was going to be a beautiful day for new beginnings.